Have you ever looked into your husband's eyes and realized your greatest enemy possessed the gentlest smile? They stole everything from me: love, wealth, and pride, throwing a razor sharp excuse in my face. They claimed it was none of my business, but they forgot one crucial calculation. Time is a perfect whetstone to turn a rusty blade into the sharpest weapon. Let me tell you how I patiently waited 5 years to return those exact words to them. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Everly Hunter. At 32 years of age, I thought I had constructed the perfect life, heavily insulated from the very catastrophes I analyzed for a living. As a senior risk assessor at Meridian Crest Holdings in Seattle, my days were defined by calculating probabilities, identifying vulnerabilities, and mitigating disasters for multi-million-dollar portfolios. I was exceptionally good at my job. That precision translated into a highly lucrative career, making me the undisputed financial pillar of our household. I provided an upper-class lifestyle that most people only dream about. We lived in a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Puget Sound, filled with imported Italian leather furniture and bespoke art pieces. I paid the mortgage, the premium insurances, the luxury car leases. I did it gladly, genuinely believing I was building an impenetrable fortress for my family. At the center of that fortress was my husband, Julian. He was a freelance architect, possessing an effortless, dashing charm that commanded attention whenever he walked into a room. Julian was the artist, the dreamer. While I was drowning in spreadsheets and corporate warfare, he played the role of the refined, nurturing partner to absolute perfection. I would come home exhausted after a 14-hour shift, and he would be waiting with a perfectly seared duck breast, a glass of aged Bordeaux, and a warm bath drawn. He would massage my tense shoulders and whisper sweet promises into my ear. "We are building our empire, Evie," he would say softly. "Just a few more years of this grind, and we will retreat to a quiet house in the mountains, just you and me." I drank those words like a parched traveler. I trusted him with my very soul. And then there was Clara, my younger sister, at 28 years old. Clara was the wild card I never could quite let go of. She worked freelance in the fashion industry, which usually meant she floated from one chaotic, underpaying gig to another. She was impulsive, careless with her finances, and lived a bohemian lifestyle that was entirely subsidized by my bank account. I paid off her maxed-out credit cards, covered her rent when she was short, and provided a blind, unwavering protection over her. Our parents had passed away when we were in our early 20s, and I had sworn to take care of her. I thought I was doing the right thing. To the outside world, and even to me, we were the picture of a modern, progressive family model. The dynamic between the three of us seemed flawless. Julian was the epitome of a generous, caring brother-in-law. When Clara's cheap apartment had plumbing issues, Julian spent his entire weekend fixing her sink and repainting her living room. When she needed advice on a fashion startup pitch, Julian would sit with her at our marble kitchen island for hours, sketching out branding ideas and business models. I would sit on the velvet sofa, sipping my tea, watching them laugh and collaborate, feeling a profound sense of pride. "Look at this beautiful family I have kept together," I would tell myself. But risk assessment teaches you one fundamental truth about destruction. Catastrophic failures rarely begin with a loud explosion. They start with microscopic, invisible fractures in the foundation. The first crack appeared subtly. Julian had always been careless with his phone, leaving it unlocked on the kitchen counter or tossed casually on the bed. Suddenly, it was constantly in his pocket. If he left it on the table, it was always face down. When I asked him to check the time on it once, I noticed he had changed his simple 4-digit passcode to a complex alphanumeric string. When I casually brought it up, he did not miss a single beat. "Client confidentiality, darling," he explained, kissing my forehead. Meridian Crest is not the only company with strict data security protocols. It sounded perfectly reasonable. I brushed it off. Then came the second crack, far more visceral than a locked screen. It was late autumn. Clara came over for our weekly Sunday brunch. As she leaned in to hug me, a rich, intoxicating scent enveloped my senses. Notes of midnight jasmine, rare oud, and black vanilla. It was striking, sophisticated, and undeniably expensive. In fact, I knew exactly what it was. It was a limited edition fragrance from a boutique Parisian house. A single bottle cost roughly $600. But the price tag was not what made my stomach tighten. What made my blood run cold for a fraction of a second was the memory of Julian. 3 months prior, casually lingering at a duty-free magazine in the airport, he had pointed to an ad for that exact perfume and asked me for my opinion. "What do you think of this scent profile? Does midnight jasmine suit a younger woman?" he had asked. I had told him it sounded lovely, but perhaps too mature for someone like Clara. He had nodded, turned the page, and the conversation had vanished into thin air. Now, that exact scent was radiating from my sister's skin, mingling with the aroma of the expensive coffee Julian was grinding in our kitchen. I looked at Clara's wrists, then at Julian's relaxed, smiling face as he handed her a steaming mug. The air in my luxurious, glass-walled penthouse suddenly felt agonizingly thin. The perfect facade I had funded and bled for was beginning to warp, and a sickening, silent alarm began to ring in the deepest corners of my mind. The trigger was mundane. A Tuesday evening, the automated smart home system, the one Julian had insisted on installing to make our lives seamless, started glitching. The thermostat dropped to 50 degrees, and the hallway lights flickered incessantly. Julian was out, supposedly meeting a contractor for a late dinner. I decided to reboot the main router myself. Logging into the administrative dashboard, I planned to simply clear the cache and restart the system, but my eyes, trained to spot anomalies in endless rows of corporate data, caught something in the network traffic logs. There was an unrecognized, static IP address tied to a device that was pulling massive amounts of bandwidth. It was not my laptop, not Julian's workstation, not the smart television. I pulled the network history. The device was not just passively connected, it was running heavy. Encrypted data syncs to a remote cloud server. I cross-referenced the timestamps of these massive data uploads. A cold dread washed over me. The largest spikes in activity occurred precisely on the days I was out of state. The 3-day conference in Chicago last month, the 48-hour merger negotiation in Manhattan 2 weeks ago. Every single time I boarded a plane, this ghost device woke up and started hoarding data. My risk assessment instincts, usually reserved for unmasking fraudulent corporate shell companies, took over entirely. Panic is a useless emotion. Information is power. I needed to know what was bleeding out of my network. I traced the media access control address. It belonged to the sleek, silver tablet we kept on the living room coffee table, the one we supposedly only used to control the sound system and order takeout. I waited until 1 in the morning, long after Julian had returned and fallen into a deep, rhythmic sleep beside me. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and took the tablet into my home office. I locked the door. Using specialized packet sniffing and data retrieval software I utilized for corporate audits, I bypassed the basic user interface and dug into the root directory. It took me less than 45 minutes to find it. Buried deep within a maze of system cache folders was a hidden, encrypted partition. It was labeled simply as Project Oakhaven. Julian did not have any clients associated with that name. I ran a brute force decryption algorithm, my heart hammering a brutal rhythm against my ribs. The progress bar crawled, 10%, 40%, 90%. Access granted. I opened the folder, expecting to find embezzled funds or perhaps stolen blueprints. Nothing could have prepared me for the grotesque reality that flooded the screen. There were no architectural sketches. There were hundreds of media files, videos and high-resolution photographs. I clicked the first thumbnail. The air vanished from my lungs. I was staring at my own bedroom, my custom-made silk sheets, and writhing in the center of that bed were Julian and Clara. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle the visceral, animalistic gasp that threatened to tear from my throat. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to watch. I forced myself to witness my sister, the girl I had protected and provided for since childhood, throwing her head back in ecstasy while my husband, the man who promised me a quiet mountain retreat, kissed down her neck. The timestamp on the video was from a Tuesday afternoon, barely 4 hours after I had left for the airport on my last business trip. My hands shook violently, but I kept clicking. Folder after folder, image after image, they had documented their depravity with a sickening level of pride. They filmed themselves in the guest bathroom, on the kitchen island where I drank my morning coffee, and even on the balcony overlooking the city skyline. But the sickness did not stop at the flesh. The betrayal ran infinitely deeper. Beside the media files was a subfolder titled Logistics. I opened it, my blood turning to ice water. Staring back at me were flawless, scanned copies of my most sensitive financial documents. There were joint investment portfolio statements, property deeds, and worst of all, a general power of attorney document I had signed months ago when Julian claimed he needed authorization to handle municipal permits for a supposed home renovation. Right below that was a newly approved application for a massive line of credit, secured against the equity of our penthouse. The signature was mine, but I had never seen the document in my life. He had forged it, using the power of attorney as leverage. This was not a tragic, impassioned affair. This was a calculated, systematic financial heist. I was not just a betrayed wife, I was a target. The final, fatal blow came from a text document labeled Backup Logs. It contained exported chat transcripts between Julian and Clara. I read their words, my vision sharpening into razor-focused clarity. "Did she sign the equity release yet?" Clara had written on the 15th of October. "Working on it tonight," Julian replied. "Just need to pour her a stiff drink and complain about the contractor delays. She signs whatever I put in front of her. The boring money printing machine is too tired to read the fine print." "Good," Clara texted back. "Hurry up and drain the joint accounts. I am so sick of pretending to be grateful for her scraps. We need to secure the capital before we kick her out on the street. I want that penthouse. Julian." "You will have it all, baby. Every last dime." I sat in the dark office, the harsh blue light of the screen illuminating my face, the woman who had entered this room an hour ago. The devoted wife and the protective older sister was dead. They had murdered her right here in the digital glow of their own arrogance. I did not cry. There were no tears left to fall, only a cold, terrifying void where my heart used to be. The panic was gone. The shock had evaporated. What replaced it was a crystalline, absolute resolve. They wanted to play a game of risk and ruin. They had no idea who they had invited to the table. I needed the perfect stage. Exactly 1 week later marked our 5th wedding anniversary. Julian, ever the devoted husband in the eyes of the world, insisted on hosting an intimate, lavish dinner at the penthouse. Clara, naturally, was invited to toast to our enduring milestone. The sheer audacity of them sitting at my table, eating the food I paid for, preparing to celebrate the marriage they were actively butchering, fueled my absolute composure. The evening was sickeningly perfect. Crystal glasses clinked. The aroma of roasted lamb filled the room. Julian uncorked a bottle of vintage champagne, the golden liquid bubbling cheerfully as he filled our 3 flutes. He raised his glass, wearing that trademark dazzling smile, ready to deliver a poetic speech about love and loyalty. I did not touch my glass. Instead, I reached into the leather tote bag resting beside my chair. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I stood up slowly and tossed it directly onto the center of the dining table. The folder hit the mahogany surface with a sharp, heavy thud. The clasp broke open. Dozens of glossy, high-definition photographs spilled out, sliding across the pristine white linen. They came to rest right next to the bubbling champagne. Images of Julian and Clara tangled together in my bed, completely unclad, frozen in their acts of betrayal. Beneath the photographs were the highlighted bank statements, the forged equity lines, and the exported chat logs detailing their plot to ruin me. The silence that followed was absolute. The room felt entirely drained of oxygen. "I believe a comprehensive explanation is in order," I said. My voice was eerily calm, devoid of any tremor. I braced myself for the predictable reactions. I expected Julian to turn pale, to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. I expected Clara to burst into theatrical tears, pleading that it was a mistake, that she was confused. I had prepared myself for their pathetic groveling. But that is not what happened. Julian looked down at the photos. Then, he slowly lifted his gaze and locked eyes with Clara across the table. A silent, terrifying communication passed between them. In a matter of seconds, the masks they had worn for years simply melted away. The warmth vanished from Julian's eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. The girlish innocence completely drained from Clara's posture. Clara reached out, picked up one of the most explicit photographs, and examined it with a chilling level of detachment. She tossed it back onto the pile and leaned back in her chair. She crossed her arms and let out a short, mocking laugh. "You always have to make everything a corporate presentation. Do you not?" Clara sneered. Her voice was harsh, entirely stripped of the sweet, dependent tone I was so accustomed to. "Look at you. You are cold. You only ever care about your work and controlling every single person around you. You treat us like your employees. Julian and I, we are genuinely in love. We have a real connection, something you could never understand with your spreadsheets and risk models." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "To be perfectly blunt," she stated smoothly, "this is none of your business." The sheer sociopathic nature of her words struck me like a physical blow. Before I could even process the absurdity of my sister telling me my husband's affair was none of my business, Julian intervened. He did not look apologetic, he looked triumphant. "She is right," Julian said, taking a casual sip of his champagne. "And since you went digging, we might as well skip the transition period. You see that joint venture contract you signed last month? The one for the supposed real estate flip? You really should have read the addendums. There was a legal loophole regarding shared marital assets and corporate liability. As of 48 hours ago, the vast majority of your liquid capital and the equity of this penthouse have been legally transferred into a private trust, a trust controlled entirely by Clara and myself." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, pointing a finger at me. "You have been outplayed. The money is gone. This apartment is tied up in our new holding company. I suggest you go to your bedroom, pack a single suitcase, and walk out that front door tonight. If you try to fight this, if you make a scene or try to smear our names in public, I will tie you up in litigation so long you will go bankrupt paying legal fees. I will sue you for defamation and corporate espionage for hacking my devices. Leave quietly." They had planned for this. They had weaponized my trust, drained my resources, and now they were tossing me aside like garbage, confident that they had thoroughly destroyed my ability to fight back. They expected me to scream. They wanted me to shatter, to break down in hysterics, to give them the satisfaction of my total emotional collapse. I refused to give them a single drop of my sanity. I did not scream. I did not throw the champagne in their faces. I simply looked at the two monsters sitting at my table. I swallowed the burning, suffocating knot of agony in my throat, forcing my tears to stay completely suppressed. Without a single word, I turned around and walked into the master bedroom. I pulled a small duffel bag from the closet. I did not take clothes or jewelry. I packed my passport, my social security card, my specialized encrypted hard drives containing my raw career data, and the physical keys to my private safety deposit box that they knew nothing about. I walked back out. Julian and Clara were already eating their dinner, murmuring to each other, completely unbothered by my presence. I walked out the front door and stepped into the freezing, biting wind of the Seattle night. As the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, the last thing I heard was the faint, muffled sound of their shared half-smirks turning into quiet laughter. 5 years is a long time, It is exactly 1,825 days. For some, it is enough time to forgive, to heal, to move on. For me, it was the exact amount of time required to construct an absolute masterpiece of ruin. I channeled every ounce of my humiliation, every jagged shard of betrayal, into a blinding, white-hot ambition. I walked into the sleek, towering offices of Vanguard Nexus, one of the most ruthless and powerful venture capital and asset acquisition funds in the southern United States, and I went to war. I did not just climb the corporate ladder. I dismantled it and built my own elevator. I worked 90-hour weeks. I analyzed market vulnerabilities with a predatory precision that terrified my competitors and deeply impressed the board of directors. Within 3 years, I was promoted to vice president. By year 4, I was named a senior partner, holding absolute discretionary authority over a war chest worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was no longer a simple risk assessor. I was the executioner. While I was building an empire on solid bedrock, Julian and Clara were busy constructing a castle out of sand. They had taken the liquid capital they stole from me and launched a commercial real estate development firm. For a brief, fleeting moment, it looked like they had won. They rode the crest of a massive, unprecedented real estate bubble. They bought up prime downtown lots, slapped together flashy architectural renders, and pre-sold luxury commercial spaces before breaking ground. Magazines featured them as a visionary power couple. They bought a sprawling mansion, drove imported Italian sports cars, and lived the exact life they had violently ripped away from me. But a bubble is just air wrapped in a thin, fragile illusion, and I never took my eyes off them, not for a single second. While they were popping vintage champagne on leased yachts, I was quietly compiling a dossier. I had a dedicated server in my home office solely tracking their corporate filings, their permit applications, and their subcontractor liens. Because I knew Julian, I knew his arrogance. He was an artist, not an economist. He lacked the fundamental discipline required to sustain exponential growth. And Clara was a parasite, concerned only with the immediate gratification of wealth, entirely ignorant of the mechanics required to maintain it. Slowly, the cracks began to show. I tracked their disastrous investment decisions. They were over-leveraging their assets, taking out massive bridge loans at 14% interest rates to fund ghost projects that were permanently stalled in the zoning phase. They were shifting money from new investors to pay off the dividends of older ones, teetering dangerously close to a classic Ponzi structure. They were drowning in massive toxic debt, frantically trying to hide it behind aggressive marketing campaigns and fake social media opulence. That was when I made my move. I did not confront them. I did not send threatening letters. I simply weaponized my position at Vanguard Nexus. Using my extensive network of power, I established a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. I registered limited liability companies in Delaware, set up holding companies in the Cayman Islands, and deployed proxy corporate entities scattered across the globe. Through these completely anonymized fronts, I began to systematically purchase their debt. Whenever one of their lenders got nervous and wanted to offload Julian's high-risk promissory notes at a steep discount, my shell companies were there, quietly buying them up. I bought their convertible bonds. I bought the secondary mortgages on their commercial properties. I purchased the mechanics liens from the construction contractors they had failed to pay. Over the course of 18 months, I spent tens of millions of dollars of Vanguard capital accumulating their liabilities. It was a perfectly calculated, invisible encirclement. To Julian and Clara, these transactions looked like routine financial restructuring. They thought they were simply getting life-saving extensions from faceless institutional lenders. They had absolutely no idea that the various corporate entities tightening the noose around their necks all pointed back to one single desk on the top floor of a skyscraper in Austin. They thought they had outsmarted the boring, tedious money machine. They failed to realize that I had stopped printing money for them. I had started printing their death warrant. I owned their loans. I owned their buildings. I owned their entire future. I was just sitting in the dark, patiently waiting for the music to stop. The music finally stopped in the middle of a sweltering July. It happened with a velocity that even my most aggressive risk models had not fully anticipated. The commercial real estate market did not merely cool down, it violently imploded. The Federal Reserve hiked interest rates 3 consecutive times in a span of 6 months. The cheap money vanished overnight, and the bubble burst with a deafening roar. For Julian and Clara, the impact was nothing short of apocalyptic. Their entire empire was built on a fragile house of cards, heavily reliant on continuous refinancing. When the credit markets froze, their chain of leverage violently snapped. One defaulted bridge loan triggered a cross-default clause on a second property, which then triggered a third. Within a matter of 72 hours, their primary lending institution froze all of their corporate operating accounts. But the financial ruin was merely the appetizer. Desperation breeds unfathomable stupidity. In their blind panic to cover the massive capital shortfalls and keep their sinking ship afloat, Julian and Clara had made the fatal error of commingling new investor funds to pay off old toxic liabilities. The Securities and Exchange Commission noticed the glaring irregularities. Less than a month later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally opened a criminal inquiry into multiple counts of wire fraud and illegal syndication practices. They were no longer just staring at bankruptcy. They were staring down the barrel of a 15 to 20-year federal prison sentence. Cornered, drowning in a sea of subpoenas, and facing the absolute destruction of his freedom. Julian frantically searched for a miracle. He spent weeks cold-calling private equity firms across the country, begging for a distressed buyout or an emergency capital injection. Every single door slammed shut in his face. Nobody in their right mind wanted to touch a radioactive, fraud-ridden portfolio that was actively being investigated by the federal government. In his manic, sleepless research for Tier 1 asset acquirers, he finally stumbled upon the executive roster of Vanguard Nexus, and there, staring back at him in high definition, was my face. The woman he had casually discarded like garbage was now listed as a senior partner. Sitting on top of the only financial institution in the hemisphere capable of swallowing his massive $80 million debt and bailing him out. He did not attempt to call. He knew I would not answer. Instead, he boarded a commercial flight to Texas. For 4 consecutive days, he camped outside the towering glass atrium of the Vanguard building, pacing the pavement like a stray dog. On a blistering Thursday afternoon, as I was walking through the VIP executive lobby flanked by my 2 personal security guards, a ragged figure lunged from the shadow of a marble pillar. My guards intercepted him instantly, pinning his arms behind his back with ruthless efficiency, but he thrashed against their grip. Everly, please just give me 5 minutes." The voice was shrill, cracking with raw panic. I stopped walking. I raised a single hand, signaling my guards to ease their hold just enough so I could look at him properly. The sight was breathtakingly pathetic. The dashing, effortlessly sophisticated architect who had sipped vintage champagne while stealing my life was entirely gone. Julian looked aged by at least 2 decades. His tailored designer suit hung off his emaciated frame like dirty rags. His eyes were severely bloodshot, sunken deep into dark, purple hollows. He was physically trembling, sweating profusely under the harsh Texas sun filtering through the glass ceiling, reeking of stale alcohol and sheer terror. Realizing I was actually looking at him, his legs gave out. He collapsed right there on the pristine granite floor of the lobby. He fell heavily to his knees, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy executives and board members passing by. He clasped his shaking hands together, heavy tears streaming down his unwashed face. "Everly, I am begging you on my knees," he sobbed, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "They are going to lock us up. The federal agents raided our main office on Tuesday morning. They took the servers, the hard drives, everything." He let out a loud, ugly gasp for air. Grabbing at the hem of my tailored skirt before my guard kicked his hand away, he did not even flinch. He just kept crying. "Clara is falling apart," he choked out. "She is having severe, daily panic attacks. She cannot eat. She cannot leave the bedroom. She is terrified. Evie, we are going to lose the mansion, the cars, our entire livelihood. We are going to a federal penitentiary. To hear him weaponize the word family, to watch him use the sister he corrupted as a human shield to save his own skin, was a masterclass in sociopathy. He was not sorry for what he had done to me. He was only sorry that the consequences had finally caught up to him. He was hoping that the woman who used to pay his bills was still alive somewhere inside of me, ready to write one last check to make the bad things go away. He looked up at me, attempting to summon that old, manipulative charm through his snot and tears. It was a grotesque display. "I know I destroyed you," he cried, his voice dropping into a desperate, theatrical whisper meant only for me. "I know what we did was unforgivable, but you are the only person on earth with the capital to restructure this mess. Vanguard can buy the firm, clear the federal audit, and save us. Please, Everly, I am begging you. After all, we were family once. You raised Clara. You loved us. I know there is still goodness and mercy in your heart. Please, I implore you, save what is left of the humanity in me. Do not let us be destroyed like this." I did not sneer. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single flicker of vindictive triumph to cross my face. Gloating is an emotion reserved for those who still care, for those who need validation. I needed nothing from the trembling, broken creature kneeling on the lobby floor. I simply looked down at him with the detached, polite curiosity one might reserve for a dying insect on a sidewalk. "Release him," I instructed my security personnel quietly. "Stand up, Julian," I said smoothly. "This is a place of business. Let us go upstairs and discuss your portfolio." I turned on my heel and walked toward the private executive elevators. I could hear his frantic, shuffling footsteps following closely behind me. The ride up to the 54th floor was entirely silent. Julian stood in the corner of the polished steel cab, wiping his face with the back of his trembling hand, leaving a smear of dirt across his cheek. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined designer suit. I stared straight ahead at the brass doors, watching the floor numbers climb higher and higher, taking us far above the noise of the city. The elevator chimed, and the doors glided open to reveal the crown jewel of Vanguard Nexus. The executive boardroom was a vast, minimalist expanse of dark walnut and frosted glass, featuring floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows that offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Austin skyline. I gestured gracefully toward one of the plush leather chairs opposite the massive conference table. "Please, take a seat." Julian practically collapsed into the chair. He gripped the edge of the polished table, his knuckles turning white. I took my place at the head of the table. I did not sit down. I pressed a single silver button on the intercom console. "Eleanor," I spoke into the device, "bring in the red file, please." A moment later, the heavy glass doors opened silently. My senior assistant walked in, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She placed a thick, crimson leather binder directly in front of me, gave a brief, professional nod, and left the room. I rested my fingertips gently on the cover of the binder. I looked at Julian. He was watching the file as if it contained the cure to a terminal disease. "You are asking Vanguard Nexus to initiate an emergency buyout of your commercial real estate firm, correct?" I asked, my voice carrying the crisp, neutral tone of a standard corporate negotiation. "You need us to absorb your liabilities, satisfy the primary lenders, and recapitalize your operating accounts to stave off federal bankruptcy and the subsequent criminal indictments." "Yes," Julian choked out, nodding violently. "Yes, exactly. Vanguard has the liquidity. You can restructure the debt. You can make the auditors go away. Everly, I know you can. Just tell me what you want. Any percentage of equity, anything." I smiled politely. It was a cold, practiced smile. I flipped the crimson binder open, extracted the first stack of heavy, watermarked documents, and slid them smoothly across the long wooden table until they stopped right in front of his trembling hands. I suggest you read the executive summary on the first page, I offered softly. Julian practically scrambled to pick up the papers. His eyes darted frantically across the bold headings and the dense paragraphs of legal text. At first, his expression was merely confused. He blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the financial jargon. Then, he read the second paragraph, and the third. I watched the exact millisecond his reality fundamentally shattered. It was a beautiful thing to witness. All the remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His jaw went completely slack. The papers in his hands began to shake so violently that they rattled against each other. What Julian was reading was a comprehensive, unredacted chain of title for every single ounce of corporate debt his company possessed. The document detailed how a mysterious holding company in Delaware had purchased the defaulted mezzanine loan on his flagship high-rise project. It showed how a proxy firm in the Cayman Islands had acquired the secondary mortgages on his luxury subdivisions. It laid out, with brutal clarity, how a web of offshore entities had systematically bought up all of his convertible bonds, his mechanic liens, and his overdue promissory notes. And at the very bottom of the page, in bold, undeniable print, the document revealed the ultimate parent corporation that wholly owned and controlled every single one of those shell companies. Vanguard Nexus Special Acquisitions Fund. Managing Director with sole discretionary authority, Everly Hunter. The twist struck him with the devastating force of a sledgehammer. The absolute horror dawning in his eyes was intoxicating. He finally understood. I was not the lifeline sitting on the shore waiting to throw him a rope. I was the architect of the storm. I was the one who had quietly choked off his credit lines. I was the one who had purchased his debt and intentionally refused to grant him the standard grace periods, forcing his company into rapid, catastrophic default. I had systematically dismantled the financial pillars of his stolen empire, cornering him so tightly that he had no choice but to commit the very wire fraud that the federal agents were now investigating him for. The papers slipped from his fingers, scattering across the floor. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form a single coherent syllable. He had walked willingly into the slaughterhouse and fallen to his knees to beg the butcher for mercy. I stood up slowly, drawing myself to my full height. I looked down into the wide, terrified eyes of the man who had slept in my bed, spent my money, and plotted my ruin. I tapped my index finger lightly against the polished wood of the table. You flew thousands of miles to come here and beg me to save your lives, Julian, I asked. My voice was perfectly even, entirely devoid of emotion. Julian let out a pathetic, suffocated whimper. He nodded in absolute despair, heavy, agonizing tears of genuine regret finally spilling over his cheeks as he realized the inescapable finality of his doom. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the table, bringing my face just inches from his. I looked straight through him, and with deliberate, razor-sharp precision, I delivered the exact words I had kept locked in the darkest vault of my mind for 5 long years. I am so sorry, I whispered softly, but whether the two of you live or die is honestly none of my business. I did not wait for his reaction. I stood up, turned my back to him, and pressed the security button on my console. Escort this man out of the building, I ordered. If he ever steps foot on Vanguard property again, have him arrested for trespassing. 2 massive guards entered immediately. They grabbed Julian by the arms and hauled him to his feet. He did not fight them. He did not scream. He was entirely catatonic, utterly broken by the crushing weight of his own destruction. They dragged his limp, defeated body out of the boardroom, the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. I did not waste another moment thinking about him. That very afternoon, sitting at my desk, I formally signed the executive order denying his firm any opportunity for debt restructuring. I initiated the immediate liquidation of all their commercial assets, and as a final, meticulous courtesy, I had my legal team compile a pristine, organized dossier of their fraudulent wire transfers and overnighted it directly to the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By 6 o'clock that evening, the office was quiet. I walked over to my private bar, poured myself 2 fingers of exceptionally rare Kentucky bourbon, and stepped over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the rich, smoky warmth burn down my throat as I watched the Texas sun set, painting the sky in violent, beautiful shades of crimson and gold. The air was finally clear. The past was completely reduced to ash. It was a perfect ending. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.